So I have a question for you, and it's a perfect piggyback on what we were just talking about. What does politics have to do with architecture?
Depends on what scale of politics.
In Turkey, you have to get permission from the government. Like, you have to have good relation with the politicians, otherwise you cannot build it.
So just to build, you need to deal with politics.
Yeah.
So-
So you can build it anywhere, even like for the dangerous areas too.
Mhm.
Even though it's illegal, you can build it. But you need to have permission before that.
Could you have said that? You need to be her voice. She's never gonna recover. She's got too much to say.
It's even illegal if you have like good relation with the politicians, you can build it.
Ah, even if it's illegal.
Yeah.
Yeah. So power, so just to build something is a political negotiation.
Yeah.
What were you gonna say, Ryan?
Like, architecture is in itself political, and it is politics. It's just politics of space. It's just like a lot of architecture. I mean, some architecture doesn't divide space, but a lot of it does. You know, it's like a wall between the outside and the inside. It's a lot of different things, and how architects deal with those politics of this space versus that space.
Ah.
It's a huge part of it.
So, architecture that divides people is political. Is that what you're saying? You use the
Or-
example of the wall.
Yeah, I mean, that's like one example, but there's also architecture that creates a skin between people, but necessarily doesn't divide them, right? I don't know, it's like, there's a lot of, this is a very broad.
Think heterotopia, right? And if I'm understanding correctly what you're trying to say, architecture in itself, by the fact of its existence, dictates a kind of political negotiation of the space within it. When I walk into a building, then I'm automatically receiving messages by the building that is kind of telling me how I'm supposed to act or perform, right? The fact that this is a classroom, we know that it's a classroom because it's bound by these walls and it has a ceiling and a floor, but not just that, because of its architectural configuration. And we're expected to perform up to the standards of this. Is that what you're saying? Or,
That was a little bit past what I was saying.
okay.
So help him
A
out.
couple of 100 years.
So help him out. What's,
I think you got it the first time.
yeah?
We said just architecture itself, and I can't remember exactly what he said.
How would you say it?
In the beginning part, I think he said
But how would you say it? Someday someone's going to ask you, someday someone in your presence is going to say, architecture's not political. Why do you even bring that in? What do you say? What? But you got to be more articulate. You got to convince them. This is your colleague. You're on a team, and you're either going to make a difference in the world or you're just going to spin your wheels. It's up to you to convince your colleague to get on board. Someone help them out. So this is a problem for everyone, right? What do you say? Your colleague just said politics has nothing to do with architecture. What do you say?
Well, I think in a lot of cities where you see like a lot of control settlements, that's partially due to like governments of those cities have decided to support a certain like class of people.
Mhm.
And like I was in those cities, like in Mumbai, where like they decided to support a certain type of thing, and then anybody who either wasn't on board or wasn't in a situation who was able to get on board
Mm-hmm.
kind of now doesn't have the capability to build proper proper like means of like utilities or like proper spaces like gather and such like that. That's the informal settlements start to form rather than these large urban landscapes.
Yeah, when we organize in governments, we tend to support people in the formal economies who can afford stuff, and then we leave everyone else out.
I got you. I just have to check the dictionary, I probably could. But politics is practically coming together to solve a problem. Right?
Yeah.
So, and that's the goal, that should be the goal of architects and what they're trying to do.
Right? So there's no problem, right? Architects come together and we solve problems for people. No problem, right?
We create more problems.
But if we're doing our best, and that's what we do. We get together and we solve problems for people, right?
Well, the thing is, architecture doesn't necessarily have to do what architects do. Architecture can be like, architecture is something that changes people's perspective of their environment.
Architecture changes people's perspective of their environment.
Yeah.
Architecture changes people's environment, not only their perspective. Like,
So it does both.
yeah.
So that's interesting. Okay. What's the next question? Does every human body have the right to occupy space?
Yeah.
So often it boils down to this. And the reading was a little messed up. How many of you downloaded the reading before it was 2 readings? So some of you just got the 1 reading, that the Southern California reading? How many of you read the City of Court's Fortress LA reading? Okay.
That one was first.
Yeah,
That one was first.
Yeah.
The other one
The
was
fortress was first, and then the other one was added, like.
Oh, it
later.
was?
Yeah.
Hmm.
I'm very
The
confused.
one that like you're involved in
Yeah,
was added later.
I was involved. So that's fine because the lecture is me being involved. Yeah.
So like my comment with this question is that when in that first like the Fortress LA one,
Mhm.
they were mentioning about how there were so many efforts to make sure that the homeless weren't there that it was like ridiculous, like the way that they designed benches so that no one could sleep on them, or all these other measures to make sure that like the homeless people were nowhere. Like one of my main like questions of the thing was like, why are they trying so hard to block out the homeless? Like why do they care? Why are they so like adamant about making sure that they're
Yeah.
not there if it's public space that has nothing to do with them? And like that's right about this question.
So you already face this all the time. There are homeless people in Boston, and there are even as bad as the problem is in Boston, it's 100 times worse in LA. LA is this. Have you been there? It's remarkable. And because of the events of the 80s that are reported in this Fortress LA reading, they have become concentrated. And the point made in the reading is in part, it's the concentration of the homeless in one specific area that intensifies the negative impact and further punishes them for their homelessness. Like the homelessness problem gets so much worse when you concentrate it all together. Which leads us to the next thing. And so what formal spatial institutional arrangements have a history of working best to deliver the greatest benefits to the most people? Now, there are 2 key phrases here that I've put in bold. One is the greatest benefits to the most people. You should recognize that from an earlier lecture. This was the mission of the modern movement before World War I. Like, this was the whole deal. We have all this new technology. The cost of building housing, we can mass produce it and lower the cost. And so everyone can have housing. And that was the focus of not just architecture, but entire governments, especially in Europe, but also in North America. This was the whole deal of modernism, is this explosion, not just of technology, but of political institutions. There was a dramatic democratization of everybody. Colonialism was collapsing. All these former oppressed colonial countries were being liberated, and then they gained their independence, and the new governments that fought the war of liberation and now are in control, they were like doing exactly this. The most benefits, the greatest benefits to the most people, that's the mission of modernism. It sounds a little odd now because we kind of lost track of that. We had the post-war boom and exploding middle class, which is going to be the lecture next week. So it seems a little odd, but it's worth referring back to this, the greatest benefits to the most people. The other thing is really what this class focuses on. What we're doing here is we are developing the visual graphic language of understanding how form and space and institutional arrangements all work together to produce significant outcomes in relation to this. So are we good with that? So you're going to hear, if you haven't already, formal spatial institutional arrangements. I'm going to say that a lot. So I'm going to do this very quickly because this is 2 or 3 lectures compressed into one. So strap in. LA School, it's a school of thought. It's a school of thought that, just like we expect the places that you are choosing for your term project, to a certain extent, you are going to learn what you learn because of the places you choose. If you guys are taking notes, that's cool, but I don't think you are. Can you close your laptops? Unless you're taking notes, please close your laptops. You taking notes? You guys are taking notes? Okay. Yes?
I have a question for you.
Sure.
So, regarding to the reading, how are you going to grade it?
Well, that's a great question. Because of the way we do sketch writing, you have agency, such as I am choosing to paraphrase and capture certain things, and I'm choosing to ignore other things that I don't feel are important. If you chose to ignore that additional reading, or if you never were aware that that additional reading was even there, then ignoring it is completely your prerogative. You do not lose any points for ignoring that second reading in this case because you didn't have access to it, right? So I will grade you on what you do. It is, in that it's a very elastic assignment because, and I do this to my graduate students, the first assignment they get where they're doing this, they get a 9-page reading. And then later in this semester, they get an 80 or 90-page reading. It's Rem Koolhaas's Delirious New York. It's kind of fun to read it, and it's got a lot of pictures, but it's 90 pages. And by the time we get to the 90-page reading, they're like, oh yeah, I got this. This looks important. I'm going to read it and paraphrase it very carefully. And this looks less important. I'm just going to skim through it. I'm going to maybe capture a few key examples. But I'm going to cut to this part, and then I'm out, right? And so there's an elasticity to the assignment that gives you agency. You are responsible for what you choose to focus on in this assignment. And we say, okay, that's what they chose to focus on. Yeah, let's just leave it at that. We'll see what you guys come up with. And we'll try to not have malfunctioning readings in the future. That was our fault, my fault. So, where was I?
LA School.
So LA teaches us certain things. And in the 20th century, architects who were paying attention to cities like Reyner Banham, have you heard of Reyner Banham? He was an important architectural theorist in the 20th century. He said LA is wacky. It's very strange. It's not like a normal city. It's nothing like the way cities work, because back in the 20th century when we talked about cities, what we were talking about New York and Chicago and Paris and London and Berlin. And those cities all have this one center, and it grows out from the center, and it's very familiar. You go to You look at the history of one city, and it's more or less similar to the formation of another city. But what's weird about Los Angeles? Yeah.
It's like a city of suburbs.
It's a city of suburbs, yeah, and it's a polycentric city. It has multiple, like this is the downtown area of Los Angeles, and officially the city of Los Angeles is this thing. It's also Los Angeles County, and it grew out like this, but then there's Santa Monica,
Hollywood, West
Hollywood,
Orange.
Pasadena,
Yeah.
you know, and it's even grown to the point where Santa Barbara, Carpinteria, all those, Ventura, all of these places, all the way to San Diego, it acts kind of like a single urban center, a single city. We call it a city. We call Los Angeles a city. But when we do that, we're not talking about LA County. We're talking about what planners call the greater metropolitan area of Los Angeles. And increasingly, it is synonymous with Southern California. And so, whereas before we talked about, this was the diagram of the Chicago School, which if you cut off this diagram right here with Lake Michigan, this is how Chicago formed. And Chicago's important just because that's where the college, the university was, where the sociologists developed this idea that there's the central business area, then there's a residential, mixed residential retail zone, then there's, the further you move out, the more, the lower the land cost, and thus it's for poorer people, until you get way out, and then that's kind of this other residential zone that is the suburbs. But then in Los Angeles, there's this very different thing that has to do with the core being just for business, no one lives there. And then there are these like zones that are very heavily produced. And there's often an emptiness until you get to these affluent gated community suburbs that are your protected enclaves away from the danger and crime and homelessness and drug stuff going on in the center. And so in the 20th century, Los Angeles was the exception. It was different from any other city that had ever formed. But increasingly, starting with Rayner Banham, he said, well, he celebrated this oddity that was Los Angeles. And since Rayner Banham, with the rise of the LA school, they started looking at this and they said, increasingly, this is the way the entire world is working. And it turns out, here we are in 2018, and sure enough, it is a lot of what we see everywhere is every place is becoming like Los Angeles. And it's driven by something we're going to look at in the next lecture, the post-war boom, economic boom, that was all about white flight out of the cities, suburbanization, the rise of the automobile as a really important driver of urban formation, and the real estate market. So a lot of the forces that form the cities have to do with how real estate economics, and you should know that by now because we've been talking about Dubai and these fancy homes and how no one lives there. And that is going to be part of this, that's part of the LA school phenomena as well. California is filled with palm trees, right? Palm trees is something that we associate with California because when the settlers got there, there were all these palm trees, right?
Put them there.
Before the real estate boom of the early post-war period, actually in the 20s, there was already a kind of a real estate boom going on. There were no palm trees. Palm trees in Los Angeles is a construct. It was an idea. And so they brought palm trees and they planted them there. and it worked. It is so burnt into our consciousness, the association between palm trees and Los Angeles. There's just no separation. That's the thing. And it was all about real estate because, and this is the image we use to just refer to the American dream. It started as the California dream, and I'm going to just drop a flag here, and we're going to come back to it later. But the California dream was the birthplace of the American dream. And the second lecture that, I didn't use that title, but the lecture that we're folding into the LA school is the American dream overseas. So really it started in LA, it expanded to the US, and now it's everywhere. And that's kind of the outline of the LA school story. If you read the Mike Davis reading, Fortress LA, it was all about this building and the neighborhood around it. Bunker Hill, basically it was a municipal effort to remove the residential neighborhood that was very impoverished at the center of LA to produce an arts enclave with the Frank Gehry's Disney concert hall at the center of it. And now it is a wonderful tourist destination, great food court and city market, right near the Bonaventure Hotel. This is one of the key actors, key sites of the reading. It's also when you get to proposing that there be elevated walkways above the street level. This is a reason why the city of Boston has banished any future elevated walkways over roadways or through the middle of the block, because it removes human occupation of the streets, because it takes all the activity off the street. And so when you go to studio and you want to do a high line thing, and a lot of your professors will be totally down with that because it's awesome architecture, right? But if I'm there, or someone else who understands this phenomena and why the Boston Redevelopment Authority has said no, never again, just understand that there are reasons that there should never be these overhead things, because it's humans on the street that creates a lively city.
The ordinance and potential, it's not eliminating the activity on the street. It's still really busy.
The street is still really busy. That's what you're saying. Yeah. But it would be busier, and would also compel the city of Boston to do something to reduce the freeway aspects of the street there.
Also, that's kind of like one pathway between two different commercial buildings, and it's not like a separated plane of people moving. It's not like a
Interesting.
uniform thing. It's
I do think that there are some applications for raised walkways, especially if it's not going over a roadway, but is instead in an alleyway or a not public venue. I do think they have applications.
And the city of Boston agrees. It agreed to the WGBH building, which is basically a building that spans across Guest Street. So it's complicated. So rule number 1, never do this. Rule number 2, do this if...
Consciously.
Yeah, it's like jazz. You have the rules, and then you break the rules. But if you're going to break the rules, who doesn't love the High Line? I love the High Line, right? But what did the High Line do to the area below the High Line? That's a dead dog space. If you're a dog and you're about to die, that's where you go, right? That's a dead dog space. But it was always a dead dog space, right? So we forgive Diller, Scofidio, Renfro, etc., because it's awesome.
also the Highline's its own thing. It's kind of
It's its own
on
thing.
the edge like suspended between residential buildings. It's not like
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
it's
it's-
not like a path. It's not like trying to be its own circulation. You know, it's not trying to.
Yeah,
be
it's a
not trying-
park.
yeah, it's trying to be its own thing and not a replacement for circulation.
It's a destination.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, so back to this. In here, there's an assumption of continuity. As a matter of fact, these are corridors that shoot across the concentric rings that create kind of continuities. But here you start to see, it says gated affluent suburbs. So the gated community aspect of the real estate market has had a very significant, so this is a gated enclave in effect with security guards and surveillance cameras. And here's a gated enclave where once you're in the Bonaventure complex, you know, you're good. You never have to mix with those goddamn homeless people. And so there's an enclavization of the city. The city becomes a collection of enclaves. Some are real estate harbors of wealth and privilege in the gated communities of the suburbs, and some are areas of exclusion. And we can't get into it too much today, but the whole thing about racism in the United States, already in the 1960s, believe it or not, in 1964, the Civil Rights Act made it illegal to discriminate in housing based on race. Anybody who wanted to move to this gated enclave or this suburb, regardless of race, creed, or religion, were welcome. It was illegal to discriminate against it. It's different than being welcome. So, that was a big moment. That was a huge victory in the civil rights movement. But surprise, surprise, it didn't solve the problem. The problem was something that was created after the Civil War, the abolition of slavery. The wealthy elites of the United States had to quickly get together and figure out what they were going to do to maintain their privilege and power, and they came up with a brilliant solution. Let's get poor white people to fear and hate the former slaves, the freed Africans, slaves that were everywhere. Let's make up stories about white women being raped by black men. Crazy, right? Crazy, because their biggest fear was the freed slaves were going to ally with the indentured servants, basically, of the poor white, and between the two of them, if they got together, that's a huge majority, and you're gonna have a political wave that's going to threaten the power of the lords of the land. So they came up with this crazy story that created distrust between what was essentially a uniform class struggle issue. And surprise, surprise, it worked brilliantly. But how long could something so insane work? Well, it turns out well into the 60s, it was still working. And with the civil rights movement, they revived it. They said, oh, sure, you might have the same economic self-interests as all these other people, but they're not white. So you should fear them. They're trying to take your privilege. And who'd have thought that would work? It worked brilliantly. Malcolm X and Martin Luther King famously and controversially said this is not about race, except as an issue of dividing the class, of disrupting the class struggle that is inevitable. Class struggle against the wealthy power interests of government and business inevitably will have to give in to the Democratic majority because we have a democratic system. It's inevitable. It's just, it's inevitable. How can we postpone that? Let's cause a disruption within what would otherwise be this unified class system. Who would have thought that would have worked? It worked brilliantly. So throughout the 60s, you had this disruption of what would have otherwise been a class struggle. But how long can you sustain that? You know, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, the civil rights movement generally shifted from a focus on race towards a focus on class. And so you have to kill the leaders, assassinate the leaders. And they started to look at the Vietnam War, and it's like a series of Hail Mary passes, because it's inevitable that the majority will get their way, as it has always happened throughout history and around the world. But brilliantly, somehow, the United States has demonstrated a capacity to keep this thing going. And even though you have the end of slavery, you have the end of housing discrimination, even 50 years later, you still have an increasing intensification of racial segregation. This is South Central. Blue is African American households. Red is white households. Orange is Asian. Yellow is other. What am I forgetting? Oh, orange is Hispanic. Green is Asian. So these maps have been developed. So this has a dissimilarity score of 65. Anything over 60 is considered significant. So what do you do? So a lot of this is about real estate, that you are able to create real estate segregation, even though it's illegal. This extreme, and part of it is the gated communities, and I'm not going to show you gated communities now because I'm going to show you when we get overseas, when we get to the American dream overseas. And so how do you maintain these gated enclaves? You do it through, let's see. Oh, I'm pushing the wrong button, that's why. So the enclavization of the urban form, and what you have to do at Bunker Hill that Mike Davis is talking about, you do it through surveillance. This is an important reference point. We're getting back to Foucault's heterotopia. Foucault wrote a book called Discipline and Punish, where he said, we define normal, and then we discriminate against non-normal. We create heterotopias for those non-normal, and then we control them. This is the key reference point for the control that architecture is capable of imposing. Have you heard of the panopticon? What is the panopticon?
It's a means to control a mass population with fear, I guess. I don't know.
Not
You're probably gonna.
fear, but
Well,
yeah.
it's a formal spatial institutional
Yeah.
arrangement vividly demonstrated by Jeremy Bentham's 1890-ish invention of the panopticon prison,
yeah.
where if you put one guard in a tower at the center of a cylinder and you place every cell with one wall completely open to the view of the one guard, and you put a window on the other side so that you can't scratch your nose without it being visible to the guard, right? So everything you do in this cell is visible to the guard.
Think Big Brother, that kind of arrangement.
And
Somebody's
so
watching
it's
you.
a
Yeah.
brilliant architectural tool if you have a devious mind. And it gets even more devious. What if you couldn't tell if there was a guard in there or not? What if there were slits on each of these faces where the guard could see out through the slit and see every single thing you do, but you can't tell if the guard's looking at you? Like here, if the guard's looking this way, this guy over here could kill his cellmate or do something. So the control is incomplete until you make the observer invisible. When the observer becomes invisible, you just have the feeling that you're either being watched or you could be being watched, you don't know, right? As a matter of fact, the way the guard gets here is not through this door anymore. The more devious way is through a tunnel. The guard might be in here, the guard might not be in here. So now you have the ultimate architecture of surveillance and control and power. You are all being observed. We are all being observed. We're not sure if they're listening to everything we say or tweet or text, but they could be. So watch yourself. And so this is the ultimate architecture of control and surveillance. We don't need to shape every building this way, although for a while it was prison architecture, it was hospital architecture, especially insane asylums, which got special attention from Michel Foucault. Schools,
Quarantines, you mentioned.
quarantines, schools, like this, there's a certain panopticon thing going on here. In Blount, when we're doing quizzes and big lecture courses, I go in back so I can see what's going on screens, and so I'm operating as the prison guard. I'm very conscious that I'm using the architecture of the panopticon to control cheating on the quiz. You know about what's happening in downtown London? What's happening in downtown London? They have surveillance cameras throughout the downtown area, and they have employed architecture graduates to use their fancy 3D modeling software to model faces, to develop very sophisticated facial recognition software. And that's why, who's gotten a passport photo taken recently? Is it passport, or what is it? Is it or is it the driver's license? Do you ever have to have a photo taken from 2 angles? Someone asked me for a photo. Yeah, a mugshot would do it. But I can't remember if it's for driver's license, or maybe it's the TSA the airline security.
Do that, 'cause
I think it's that.
yeah, not passport.
So they're starting to take photos from 2 angles so that the fancy facial recognition software can do things like track people in the city of London. You can identify someone and then follow them. The computer will follow them through the city of London. And that's the future of architecture in cities. I'm not going to get into that. Has everyone seen this?
I saw recently that I can't get out of my head. A Harvard business professor and economist asked more than 5,000 Americans how they thought wealth was distributed in the United States. This is what they said they thought it was. Dividing the country into 5 rough groups at the top, bottom, and middle 3 20% groups.
Have you seen this?
They asked people how they thought
Okay.
the wealth in this country was divided. Then he asked them what they thought was the ideal distribution. And 92%, that's at least 9 out of 10 of them, said it should be more like this. In other words, more equitable than they think it is. Now that fact is telling, admittedly. The notion that most Americans know that the system is already skewed unfairly. But what's most interesting to me is the reality compared to our perception. The ideal is as far removed from our perception of reality as the actual distribution is from what we think exists in this country. So ignore the ideal for a moment. Here's what we think it is again. And here is the actual distribution. Shockingly skewed. Not only do the bottom 20% and the next 20%, the bottom 40% of Americans barely have any of the wealth. I mean, it's hard to even see them on the chart. But the top 1% has more of the country's wealth than 9 out of 10 Americans believe the entire top 20% should have. Mind-blowing. But let's look at it another way, because I find this chart kind of difficult to wrap my head around.
So this is an example of data visualization. This is something that architects are trained to do extremely well. Edward Tufte in the 90s invented a new field. Who's heard of Edward Tufte? Called information design. And information design is defined as the facts, the way the facts are represented is as powerful as the facts themselves. So there's something about the representation of reality that is extremely powerful. That's what architects do. That's what maps tend to do. And so they're able to deal with complexity with a simplicity of a visual representation. And that's what this is, an example
And
of.
let's reduce the 311 million Americans to just a representative 100 people. Make it simple. Here they are: teachers, coaches, firefighters, construction workers, engineers, doctors, lawyers, some investment bankers, a CEO, maybe a celebrity or two. Now let's line them up according to their wealth. Poorest people on the left, wealthiest on the right, just a steady row of folks based on their net worth. We'll color code them like we did before based on which 20% quintile they fall into. Now let's reduce the total wealth of the United States, which was roughly $54 trillion in 2009, to this symbolic pile of cash. And let's distribute it among our 100 Americans. Well, here's socialism, all the wealth of the country distributed equally. We all know that won't work. We need to encourage people to work and work hard to achieve that good old American dream and keep our country moving forward. So, here's that ideal we asked everyone about. Something like this curve. This isn't too bad. We've got some incentive, as the wealthiest folks are now about 10 to 20 times better off than the poorest Americans. But hey, even the poor folks aren't actually poor, since the poverty line has stayed almost entirely off the chart. We have a super healthy middle class with a smooth transition into wealth. And yes, Republicans and Democrats alike chose this curve. 9 out of 10 people, 92%, said this was a nice, ideal distribution of America's wealth. But let's move on.
Notice that the middle class is in the middle. That's very important. And it's also worth noting that he doesn't say, this is close more or less to the distribution in the post-war period during the boom. It was a massive expansion of the middle class if you were white, and the rising consumerism is what drove the economy.
Not as equitable, clearly, but for me, even this still looks pretty great. Yes, the poorest 20 to 30% are starting to suffer quite a lot compared to the ideal, and the middle class is certainly struggling more than they were, while the rich and wealthy are making roughly 100 times that of the poorest Americans, and about 10 times that of the still healthy middle class. Sadly, this isn't even close to the reality. Here is the actual distribution of wealth in America. The poorest Americans don't even register. They're down to pocket change. And the middle class is barely distinguishable from the poor. In fact, even the rich between the top 10 and 20 percentile are worse off. Only the top 10% are better off. And how much better off? So much better off that the top 2 to 5% are actually off the chart at this scale. And the top 1%, this guy, well, his stack of money stretches 10 times higher than we can show. Here's his stack of cash, restacked, all by itself. This is the top 1% we've been hearing so much about. So much green in his pockets that I have to give him a whole new column of his own, because he won't fit on my chart. 1% of America has 40% of all the nation's wealth. The bottom 80%, 8 out of every 10 people, or 80 out of these 100, only has 7% between them. And this has only gotten worse in the last 20 to 30 years. While the richest 1% take home almost a quarter of the national income today, in 1976, they took home only 9%, meaning their share of income has nearly tripled in the last 30 years. The top 1% own half the country's stocks, bonds, and mutual funds. The bottom 50% of Americans own only 0.5% of these investments, which means they aren't investing. They're just scraping by. I'm sure many of these wealthy people have worked very hard for their money. But do you really believe that the CEO is working?
So, and so on. So now this matters because, so this is just a clear representation of the situation. Now, where does the architecture come in? So we'll get back to the presentation. So is everyone okay? I'm sorry about that. So here's here's Detroit. See if you can pick out the boundaries of the city of Detroit. Can you see them? The municipal city of Detroit is very visible in the racial divide, most clearly here, because of white flight in the post-war period. And here's New York. The intensity of the color has to do with the density of the population. Here's Boston. New York has a dissimilarity score of 79. Boston has a dissimilarity score of 68. And so these maps are really interesting. Here's Chicago compared to Boston. Chicago has a dissimilarity score of 76. The thing is that the big question that I think is important to note didn't come up at the beginning of this is a lot of people used to say, well, architecture is a reflection of society. Architecture is this passive thing. If society is a certain way, the architecture will be built as a reflection of that reality. And that's the predominant feeling that was taught through most of the last 50 years. But increasingly, the evidence seems to suggest that the architecture is not just a passive reflection of social forces. Architecture is an instrument of producing and reproducing certain social arrangements. And so that's the big lesson of the LA school. And we see it pretty vividly demonstrated in Los Angeles. First, in Las Vegas. So what we see in Las Vegas, have you studied in your history theory courses Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown, Learning from Las Vegas, Postmodernism? No? Okay. So Denise Scott Brown, her husband Robert Venturi, and Stephen Eisenhower wrote a book based on their studio trips to Las Vegas called Learning from Las Vegas. And we're not going to get into that, but it really was a turning point that we sometimes teach in history of architecture programs that introduces the approach of postmodernism. And postmodernism has to do with celebrating certain symbols as a way of producing meaning in architecture. What they looked at is the physical form of the Strip in Las Vegas, how the architecture is developed to be legible instantaneously from an automobile traveling at highway speeds. And so here's the figure ground arrangement of the architecture of the Las Vegas Strip. And the perspective view where each casino on the Strip needs to present, and each element of the Strip needs to present itself in some memorable, symbolic iconography. And this is an important driving force of our understanding of architecture. And it continues today. Who's been to Las Vegas? Great place, isn't it? I love Las Vegas. But it's also horrifying. Why would I say it's horrifying?
Because it's a really small place and it looks so rich, and then rest of it, there's nothing.
It's a desert.
It's really artificial. It's very scarily artificial.
It's scarily artificial, right?
It's like being in a lab a little bit. It's like, yeah, it's being under a microscope a little bit, because you're...
Yeah. So, New York, right? Who doesn't love New York, right? New York is such a great place to visit, but there are homeless people and pornography in Times Square, it used to be. and it's kind of dirty and it's expensive. I would like to visit New York without all that stuff, right? You can. Paris. There's New York. There's the architecture of the Strip. So there's a certain figure ground arrangement that you have to present your image to the Strip. And behind the facade of the Strip, there's this no man's land. The desert starts right away. Paris. Who doesn't love going to Paris? But all these French people speaking their French, being all Frenchy in your face, right? I'm going to go to... yeah. So speaking of French, there's another French guy, Jean Baudrillard, forget that name, but remember this. This French philosopher came up with this idea, this concept that like heterotopia is actually quite useful. The idea of the simulacra. So write this down. A simulacra, someone write this down for Jackie. She's going to want it later. A simulacra is a reproduction of a reality that never existed. Pretty cool, huh? So if you're a real estate developer and you want to attract people to purchase your real estate, or if you're a casino owner and you want to attract people to your casino, or if you are a mayor of a Chinese city and you want to attract an international clientele to your city, then simulacra is your best bet. And architects are the purveyors of simulacra. What American architecture really perfected the simulacra?
The Eiffel Tower?
The Eiffel Tower is not in America.
Oh.
Well, it is. No, there it is. That's Las Vegas. So the Eiffel Tower is in. So the Eiffel Tower is one of the simulacras that were produced. But do you know the term Imagineering?
No, Disney.
Disney. So the Disney Corporation really identified this as a winning strategy, and they developed a team of Imagineers who were trained as architects to do this really well. And it has been a huge boon to architecture and real estate development, and it produces things like this. You know, really remarkable. It's not Venice, but it's better than Venice for a lot of people. So, so the context of this is that here's where we go overseas. Is there a third world anymore?
Absolutely.
Absolutely, there's a third world?
I mean, you don't call it the third world anymore.
Why not?
The third world was a term developed back during the Cold War when there was Russia, the United States,
Right.
and then the third world.
Okay,
was
let's break this down really quickly. What's the first world?
the United States and Russia.
No.
And Europe.
United States and Europe, the winners of World War II. First world. Right? Just to make it cut to the chase. We're all friends. We're going to do this quickly. What's the second world? The losers. The communists, the Soviet Union. The second world is the socialist, communist, state socialism. The Soviet Union, China, Cuba, China. This was the reality, the post-war reality. There was a first world. We knew who we were. There was the second world competing with that first world, right, until the end of the Cold War. And then there was the third world, right, the former colonial world that is struggling to lift itself up. And the assumption of economics and politics globally in the post-war period was the first world, it's a succession. You have to move through these steps of development, and there is no shortcut. You can't leapfrog up to a developed state. You got to go through the steps. And by the way, you're never going to catch up with us. We're always going to be on top, the first world. And good luck with that catching up. So there's another video which is income inequality in the world. Watch that on your own time. We got no time for that. But we don't say third world anymore because the third world has kind of dissipated. We now refer to developing and developed economies or emerging economies, and it's much less derogatory. We sometimes say the global north and the global south, but we're struggling because what's happening, and this is our Hans Rosling that we had before, the Hans Rosling stuff. It turns out that the richest people of South Africa are a lot like the richest people in the United States, and the poorest people in South Africa are a lot like the poorest people in South Africa have always been. Right? And same with, I think that's Namibia. I can't remember what these are. But basically, the story of this graph is you can look at it in aggregate and say, oh, look, everybody's doing better. Isn't the world a great place? And sorry, Hans Rosling, you're kind of guilty of doing this. But what's not saying is how it's distributed in here. And the distribution of wealth in every country in the world looks an awful lot like the United States. And the wealth distribution in the United States looks a lot like the wealth distribution in Nigeria. It looks a lot like the wealth distribution in the most income stratified countries of the world, which are in Latin America. So the whole world is becoming, especially in its cities, the cities are becoming concentrations of first and third world distributions. So that graph that you saw of wealth distribution in the United States, that's increasingly what every city in the world is approaching. A wealthy 1% of hyper wealth, and then a vast ocean of the urban majority that struggles to just make ends meet. And that vast majority does not include the thing we still call the middle class. What we call the middle class, just sloppily in our discussions of other cities, are the wealthiest 5 to 10% of the population. So it's the concentration of wealth at the top, but we still use the word middle. There's nothing middle about it. I recommend using the term consumer class, especially when we get to China. China has 1.3 billion people. Its consumer class is the wealthiest 5% of that 1.3 billion. What is 5% of 1.3 billion?
15 million?
Carrie.
650,000?
No, it's in the millions.
650,000?
Yeah, it's definitely the millions.
Let me find.
Something in there.
The wealthiest 5% in China? Let's make it easy. Let's do the wealthiest 1% of China.
7 million people, I think.
The wealthiest 1% of 1.3. 7 million?
Yeah, I mean,
That's 7 million people.
1.3.
That's the 5%.
So 10%, what would 10% be?
130 million.
And what would 1% be?
13 million.
13 million. Okay. So 13 million people is the wealthiest 1% in China. That's a huge consumer class. I would gladly market things to China. So that's what's driving the Chinese economy, not the 1.3 million people, billion people. It's the 13 million people in the wealthiest 1%. Or if you go to the top 5%. So let's go overseas and see what's happening there. So China opened up, with the death of Mao, it opened up to global markets. And Shanghai, the city of Shanghai had this, this is the historic center of Shanghai, the Bund, which was taken over by European powers in the 19th century and humiliated China. Now, during communism, the whole goal of China was to overcome that humiliation of the 19th century. And it's working. So China is doing what it needs to do to establish itself as a superpower. And it's doing it in part through architecture. And so it identified this location across the Huangpu River from the center of the city. It was more or less empty. And so they did what any world leader would do to establish itself as a global superpower. It ran an architectural competition for the design of this new city center. And then what do? Simulacra, Imagineering, Disney. You make a simulacra of something you think is really awesome. What's this a simulacra of? This is just the first week of the design project that we give you. Okay, create a really awesome, attractive center for financial exchange in Pudong. What do you do first? You put Manhattan, you just plop Manhattan there, right? And someone says, Manhattan? Why bother with Manhattan? I think Venice. Let's do Venice. So there's Venice. This is seriously what the architects did. No, not Venice. Not Manhattan. Paris. Right? Because a lot of the people trying to get this job were from France. And so they ran this international competition. All of the favorite architects entered things, starting from how do you create it. And surprise, surprise, the local team of architects from Shanghai kicked their butts. And they won the competition. Right? Demonstrating how great the Chinese are. And that's how you got Pudong. So Pudong, have you heard of Pudong in Shanghai? It's one time, 1/5 of the cranes in the world were all located there. They built it very, very quickly. Dubai took its lessons from Pudong. Pudong took its lessons from Singapore, which we've talked about. And now the real estate outside of Shanghai, they wanted to make gated communities. Why? Because the 13 million people of China want to live in gated communities outside their cities? Maybe, but let's hold on that. So what do? They look at the greatest cities of Europe and they do the same thing. They say, let's build a small little Paris. Let's build a small little Berlin. Let's build a small little London. And this is called Thames Town. This is a London. And it's no one lives there. It turns out it's a very, very popular place for wedding photography. Have you heard of this? So people come from all over the Shanghai region to get their wedding photos taken in this real estate development that is a new town. But no one lives there. It's basically one of these ghost cities. You've heard of these ghost cities, right?
Human history, and it's leading to the rise of the megacity.
The old gives way to the new. Entire cities emerge, seemingly from nowhere.
Well, it's absolutely phenomenal. And when you look at the
Architect.
scale of cities, Chongqing, 31.5 million people in Chongqing. And most people have never heard of it.
Melbourne architect Robert Caulfield is among the experts who've been invited in by the Chinese. They like his grand designs, and they've awarded him prized contracts to transform not just a few blocks, but entire cities.
Just over in that area there will be the new hub.
From sketch to animation to construction.
Should have had Dennis Frenchman. We should have had Dennis Frenchman on
One
this.
of our
Dennis,
projects
this is
they're actually
competition.
putting in the roads before we'd even finished the drawings, and we're
Just
just
building
producing
flag
fast
cities now.
enough. So as quick as you're drawing it, they're building it. Well, quicker than we were drawing it.
They can't draw it fast enough. The construction crews are ahead of the architects with their sketches.
It's like a corporation with a 5-year plan, everyone going in the one direction.
I've had it suggested to me that doing business with the communists is good because they make a decision.
Well, they do.
And you end up with very interesting situations like this.
Everything is here, an entire city. All the buildings, the roads, schools, hospitals, you name it. Everything that is, except the people. And looking around, there is not a soul to be seen.
It's an entire city fully operating, but there's not a single person there. And there are dozens of cities in China that are like this. They've basically created an incentive structure for local investment in building new towns, but there's just no demand for it.
It's almost like a cardboard cutout of a city.
Watch this.
A giant facade.
There's nothing there. There's nothing behind the facade.
Waiting for customers, diners, and workers.
Okay, so you get the idea. Here's another view of it. These cities are all empty.
Is the reason people doesn't have money? Like what's the reason?
Hmm?
What's the reason?
Well, in a sense, they're supplying much quicker than people are demanding. And also, these are designed as communities for the 13 million, right? What about the other 1.4 billion people? They can't afford to live here.
Yeah,
In a
but
sense.
like I'm asking why they build it then.
Because they want to drive their economy. It's mostly, their economy is shockingly dependent on construction, and when it's not being met by local demands, they're expanding worldwide.
So this is the key question, is why are these things being built way ahead of demand? I had a very embarrassing exchange with the chair of the architecture department at MIT, who was from Shanghai. We were both on the committee for a master's student who was doing research on the city of Shanghai. And the student had an awkward moment when he said, all the skyscrapers of Pudong are empty because there is no demand for any of that office space in this new financial center. And the chair of the architecture department, the man with all the power, who's from Shanghai, and he should know because he's one of China's most celebrated architects. And he said, what do you mean? Of course there's demand. They built it because there was so much demand for the architecture. So even he doesn't have a clue. We assume that whenever something gets built, it's because people need the space. Turns out that's not true. There are many reasons to build things when there's no demand. The Chinese one, especially Pudong, if you wanted to establish Shanghai as a global city of exchange in competition with Tokyo, London, and New York, this is what you do. You build it and you present an convincing architectural demonstration. Remember what we said about Medellin? Mayor Fajardo was just another politician going blah, blah, blah until he demonstrated that he meant what he was saying, and he built the library parks. And all of a sudden, he's got traction. China is just saying blah, blah, blah. We are going to be the superpower of the 21st century. Just a lot of empty, hot air until they build Pudong and say, see our skyline? We are a superpower. Quickly going to Jakarta. Jakarta is an interesting case where the Dutch came in, because it's a former Dutch colony. The Dutch came in the 70s and said, look, you got some serious environmental problems. You're about to grow a lot. Here's what you should do. You should supply infrastructure along this corridor from east to west so that all the development concentrates on that corridor. And at the center of that corridor, you should give excellent rail transportation. Put in a freeway for the fancy people. but keep all the services and amenities tightly constrained on this this east-west corridor, and then go across the island of Java as far as you need to go to accommodate that. Do not let people develop at the coastline, because there's a lot of saltwater infiltration. You're prone to sea level rises and storm surges, and do not let anyone build up in the sensitive hills to the south. That's where all the water supply comes from. You need to control flooding. You need to have high quality water, right? So the Dutch did this brilliant study, and they produced this plan. And so guess what the dictator general did in Jakarta? We see all the usual things that you're used to at this point. He decided to do exactly the opposite because it was big business to create lots of gated communities based on the simulacra approach. So we have Mount Rushmore for America. Sometimes it has a K. Here we have L'Arc de Triomphe, Il Duomo by Brunelleschi. Why not? The Sphinx. We mix the Colosseum and the Acropolis. Why not? That's the visitor center for the real estate marketing office for this new town, which is called Tourism City. So the advertising goes something like this. You can visit the world without ever leaving your gated community. Here's a photo collage of scenes from actually Beverly Hills, photo montage with some of the well, actually, I'm not sure there's anything here that is of the site, including the white people. And so Rodeo Drive is at the center of this. And so this is what the Dutch were saying, don't do this, don't create a lot of ring roads, because it'll immediately jam. Even when you get to 10% car ownership, you'll have a lot of traffic jams. So what did they do? Ring Road 1, Ring Road 2, 3, 4, 5, right? So they did the exact opposite. Here's one of those gated communities in the town where I live, and it's fully sold. This is long after it was built, fully sold. There are some people hanging out. Who are they? They are the guards, the gardeners, and the housekeepers. Who else is there? No one. So you talk to them, you say, who lives here? I did not live here. I lived in the town nearby.
And this is in Colombia?
No, this is in Indonesia, island of Java.
How many places have you lived?
I've been around. Look at all that gray. So, so you talk to them and they say, oh, we live here, right? The domestic servants, the guards, they live here to guard it. And I'd say, well, who owns it? Oh, this rich guy there and this rich guy there. He bought it, this one guy bought it for his son and bought 2 more for his daughters. And when it's time for the daughters to get, when it's time for his children to get married, he will sell this at a profit and use that to pay for the wedding. Right? That is why a lot of this real estate gets built. Is because the stock market in these places is not so secure. And so the wealthiest 1 to 10% use real estate as a place to park their money. And you've heard this before because we talked about Dubai. And you've heard this before because we've talked a bit about the distortion of real estate values in the Boston area. Or maybe we haven't. But that has also happened.
It's also a very effective way to launder money, real estate. And almost in a lot of cases in the global south, that's what happens. That's what drives real estate market economies.
So back to the LA school, there's a few more concepts. One is the concept of junk space. Have you heard that one? Junk space is a concept given to us by that Dutch architect. What's his name? Who's the Dutch architect? schoolhouse. So he said, we have these gated communities of real estate, and then those are complemented by gated communities in town like Bunker Hill, or office complexes. And then we have gated entertainment enclaves, and et cetera. And this is a diagram that kind of characterizes Los Angeles. And then what's this thing here? It connects us from our gated community to our gated enclave where we work downtown. And here's another one. It connects us to our gated enclave of entertainment. What is this little segment here?
Road.
It's the freeway. It's the urban freeway. So we leave our glass and steel air-conditioned houses, and we are going to our glass and steel air-conditioned offices or our glass and steel air-conditioned shopping enclaves, shopping entertainment enclaves downtown. And we get there by getting into our glass and steel air-conditioned quadraphonic stereo cars, which is the subject of next week. And so, what's this? What's all this? It's junk space. So junk space is the leftover space where the urban majority lives in most cities of the world, increasingly, as every city in the world becomes more and more like Los Angeles. What's the next step? Let's get rid of that little segment and let's put everything in one gated enclave, and that's what we're seeing in Indonesia, in this town. I used to hang out here a lot just to understand how this design is very similar to the palace of the Javanese royalty where I worked. And the idea was they wanted to have this walled situation suffice so that you didn't have to have walls between these communities. You could actually pretend that the world is an interconnected place, like in Brookline, right? Rich people, there are sidewalks, there are no gates between here and the wealthy neighborhoods of Brookline. So that's the ideal fantasy. They can create that as long as they put the gates out here to keep out the poor people in case they riot, which did happen in 1998, which toppled the dictator Suharto, and they broke through and they torched the shopping mall. Anyway, they torched the shopping mall. I can't remember where it is. And so they started to do this. They started to put gates in between every neighborhood. It's almost like The Walking Dead. How do you defend against the zombie apocalypse? It takes on those kinds of dimensions. And I think this is the last slide that I have. So the chapter that I co-wrote with my friend Eric is called Orange County, Java, because, as you read or might read someday, the real estate market of Indonesia is, to a large extent, an extension of the Southern California real estate industry, because there's so many interconnections, including all the architects. Most of the architects of these places in Indonesia and in China and in India and in Malaysia and elsewhere are from Southern California, or at least the United States. And so the model that they used, they would actually, this one investor got fed up, James Riotti, he got fed up with his designers. He said, no, you're getting it wrong. Come with me. They went on his private jet, they flew to LA. They pretended to be interested in buying real estate in Orange County. They asked the real estate broker to leave the house for a minute, and they brought out cameras and tape measures and sketches, and they produced a photocopy of the house in Indonesia. So Orange County is very much the prototype for a lot of these things. And so I called the chapter Orange County Java. And anticipating 20 years later, this development, which is called Orange County Java. So the important thing here is that if you start asking the question, if you look at the world, you're paying attention and you care about how architecture works, you are confronted with this world, and the question you should be asking is, what's up with that? How did these ghost cities in China ever come to be? How is it that there's a replica of the Eiffel Tower in 6 different places around the world? What's going on here? And if you're not asking that now, you're likely to ask it when your boss in your first job asks you to perform a feat of imagineering for a project. It has a lot to do with these forces of the world. It starts with income disparity. It starts with the role, and then it continues with the role of real estate is no longer just to keep up with demand for places to live or places to work or places to recreate. Increasingly, the world is being transformed by the financial pressures to diversify investments for the wealthiest 1% of the wealthiest 1%. And that's a great segue to Dubai, but we
have 2 minutes.
don't
So
have
I'll
time.
do Dubai on next Friday.
Okay.
And it'll set the stage for the automobile. You'll
Yes.
follow up with that, yeah.
That's great, thank you. So any questions or comments about this? This is challenging stuff because it is so different from anything you've been exposed to in architecture school up to now. Am I right? Have you ever been exposed to anything like this? No. This is not what your history theory course covered. So one of the challenges is to now link up. We're going to be continuing to go back in time, and eventually, at least the working hypothesis of the course is, eventually we're going to get to your familiar territory that you were engaged with during your history theory courses. Let's see if we can do that, because it really is a continuous story. This is why historians don't like to deal with what's happening now. It is very difficult. This is a dress rehearsal for a history of the 20th and 21st century that the historians of the future are likely to be telling you. At least this is our best shot at telling you the history of your own time from a future perspective. And this is what really matters, because these are the forces that you're going to have to navigate to succeed in your careers. You're going to have to understand these things in order to be effective in your chosen profession.